Okay. And yeah, so just to officially welcome you all again to this this additional winter meeting of Devon Moth Group. And one of the great advantages of having an online meeting rather than a face-to-face meeting is that we can invite speakers from further afield, people that wouldn't normally be able to come along and easily speak to us face to face. So we've made the most of that, and we've invited two guest speakers to entertain us tonight. So we'll crack on because it's them you want to hear, not me. Welcome to those just joining. Yeah, our first speaker, so as I say, there are two speakers, both from Southeast England, actually, but talking on quite different things. First up is Tim Blackburn. Tim's a professor of biology at University College London, but he's written a really cool book about moths and what moths tell us about. Well, I won't spoil it. I'll hand over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Richard. Let's see if I can make the tech work to start with.
Looks good. That's great.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me to talk to you guys today. It's a real pleasure to talk about moths at any opportunity, but particularly to a group of people who are sort of share my enthusiasm for the group as a whole. So normally I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the sort of the Jewel Box, the book that Richard mentioned, and sort of what it tries to do and how it does it, sort of give you an overview of it. Normally I have to start off these talks sort of explaining to a slightly bemused group of people the joys of catching moths, but I can skip all of that part of the talk today. However, it's probably just worth mentioning that I started trapping moths sort of on a regular basis in the summer of 2018. And although I come down to Devon, where this particular photograph is taken, this is the background of the Tamar at Weir Quay. I actually started trapping in London, in my flat in sort of urban inner London. And when I started this, it was, something of a mystery to me as to whether there was going to be anything coming to the trap at all. I mean, the habitat, London's quite relatively green city, a lot of trees, but the habitat's really not ideal for most wildlife. This is the only outside space I have on my flat. This is our little roof terrace. You can see both sides of it. So it's about sort of 3 meters by 4. It doesn't always look like this, but it's not the most hospitable of habitats. And so I was just very happy when I started to run the trap that, actually moths did turn up at all. And actually in surprising diversity, and I would say not surprisingly low numbers, but some of the species I catch in London are quite special, and sort of over 350 species of moth now on my little roof terrace, including some quite special ones, some nice migrants, and some of the species that are spreading up from the continent. So Clancy's rustic there, which appeared on my roof terrace for the first time this autumn. And even occasionally something really special. So in September last year, I caught this. This is a jackfruit borer moth, the first record for the UK, and maybe even Europe, as far as I can make out. Obviously an adventive from the local jackfruit trade, but nevertheless, just remarkable what does turn up on another roof terrace. Moths is my hobby, but my job is an ecologist. I do research on ecology at University College London, and sort of trapping moths and sort of seeing the diversity that came to the trap in London and in Devon and other places where I trap it, being an ecologist, it got me thinking about the ecology of the moth trap. So ecology is technically the scientific study of the abundance and distribution of organisms. So what we're trying to understand is why species occur where they do, in the numbers they do, and the overlap of occurrence sort of gives you the diversity or the richness of species in a given area. So the contents of a moth trap is really what it is that ecologists are trying to explain. And the contents of my moth trap then inspired me to try and write a book for the general public, to explaining how we think the natural world works, but using the moth trap as a starting point and moths as a group of organisms to illustrate the basic rules of nature from a biodiversity point of view. And actually, I think ecologists often get a bad rap. We tend to have a bit of physics envy. Physicists can explain phenomena with incredible precision and incredible detail. Ecologists, we often feel like we're sort of flapping around in the dark a bit like moths. But I would argue that actually, sort of relative to what physicists have to explain, ecologists have it really tough. So in physics, there's 17 fundamental particles, I think, something like that, and sort of 100 odd elements. But the natural world, the world of life, is far, far more complicated than that. If we just think about species, for example, globally, we have around about 1.5 million named species. Actually, 1 in 10 of these is a moth. 1 in 9, really, if you count butterflies as moths, which obviously we all should. So moths are a really good group because, such a high proportion of the species that we want to try and understand actually fall into this group. But we're already thinking, large numbers of sort of fundamental units that we're trying to understand. And even actually most of the species that we want to understand remain unknown. So, it's estimated that there's somewhere in the range of 3 to 100 million eukaryote species out there, perhaps 8 million realistically. So compared to the 17 fundamental particles for physicists, this is a phenomenal diversity of things that we want to explain, and each one of those species is different from all the rest. And that's just eukaryotes. I mean, as for prokaryotes, we just don't really have any idea how many species there are. If you look for estimates, it varies across a crazy range. Of course, that's just species. All of those species are made up of individuals. For birds, which we know pretty well, Britain, it's estimated we have around about 161 million breeding birds in the UK. Worldwide, estimate probably around 83 billion, something like that. That's a sort of ballpark number, or roughly sort of 10 birds for every person on the planet now that we've passed 8 billion people worldwide. We know birds pretty well. They're quite big and well-studied organisms. When it comes down to insects, I mean, we're really just sort of stabbing in the dark in terms of estimates of numbers. So I've seen an estimate of 10 quintillion insects. So that's 1 followed by 19 zeros. This is on I think one of the Smithsonian websites, but what the basis for this estimate is just completely unclear to me, and whether it's adults or what it means is just very opaque. But nevertheless, that's about 100 million insects for each breeding bird, which you might think is not an unreasonable estimate. It might be ballpark. Then you're sort of getting down to things like bacteria, where we've got maybe 1 billion individuals in a gram of soil, or viruses, which are pretty remarkable. There's an estimate for how many viruses on the planet, which is 1 followed by 31 zeros, so more than 1 billion viruses per insect. And actually, if you lined all those viruses up end to end, they'd cover 100 million light years. So the diversity of life on Earth is just phenomenally difficult. On top of that, all of these individuals of all of these species are interacting with other individuals of other species. So we've got 2,500 moth species in Britain. That gives us more potential moth communities than there are atoms in the universe. So in terms of the numbers of different species that could live together in the same environment, it's just incredibly complex. And then, of course, every second that the Earth has been turning, those species are being born and dying and moving, interacting. So the patterns that we're trying to understand just change constantly. So it's an incredibly difficult task being an ecologist, because the complexity that we're trying to understand is just so enormous. Which sort of then brings us to the question of, where do we even begin? But this is what the jewel box is sort of setting out to do. It's trying to explain how the natural world works. So there's a series of chapters, each sort of inspired and sort of kicking off with a species of moth or a group of moths. And the idea of each of these chapters is that sort of they build up the general rules that explain how sort of natural system works. So it's a book about sort of general scientific principles, but illuminated by specific animals, and in this case, the glorious moths that I catch in the moth trap. So when we actually think about how life works, you can really start out with just one organism, which presumably is how life itself started. And then from that point, we can then start to think about sort of how a population of organisms grows. And the fact that populations can grow and develop is because of the incredible superpower that life has, which is sort of separates it from the physical universe, and that's its ability to reproduce. So I start with this particular single individual. This is a moth I caught on my first night of moth trapping in London. Given that you're trying to identify moths largely from the patterns of scales on the wings, this one was a bit of a head scratcher when I first caught it. I'm sure that you guys know what it is, and the little or the big feathery antennae give it away. It's a gypsy moth, which is kind of an interesting species for many reasons. But from my perspective, it's interesting because it's a real testament to the ability of life to reproduce itself and for populations of specific organisms to grow. And the reason why it's a particularly fine example is because of this gentleman. So this is Leopold Trouvelot. He is a Frenchman. He went to the US. He is something of a scientific, or was something of a scientific polymath. The author Maria Popova says that he remains best known for his exquisite astronomical illustrations, but I would beg to differ. I think he remains best known because to try and use moths to produce silk, which obviously was a very valuable commodity back then as it is now, Trouvelot took a little population of gypsy moths from Europe to the United States, to his house in Medford in Massachusetts, where he tried to rear them with the aim of using them for producing silk. At some point in 1868 or 1869, some of those moths got out of his house and into his garden. He sort of realized this was a problem, but didn't do an enormous amount about it. And then he eventually moved on from here. But then sort of 20 years after these moths escaped, the new owner of the house started to notice quite a few caterpillars, and very soon the whole town was overrun. And we've got some fantastic testimony here from some of the residents of Medford. From some of the residents of Medford at the time. So Mrs. Follansby here, the walks, trees and fences and the yard and the sides of the house were covered with caterpillars. So she used to sweep them up, burn them, and in half an hour they were just as bad as ever. her trees were completely stripped of their leaves. Oops, I've done something. There we go. Mrs. Snowdon, I've seen the end of her neighbour's house so black with caterpillars that you could hardly tell what colour the paint was. And Mrs. Ransom, in the evening, we could hear the caterpillars eating in the trees. It sounded like the clipping of scissors. And these things are basically, the population exploded. They ate every leaf off every tree throughout the whole of this this town. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts was sort of mobilized to try and deal with this. So here we have some guys picking egg masses of the moths off the trees. But of course they were too late. And the gypsy moth in the States now occupies more than 1 million square kilometers of northeast North America and into Canada. And it's not always super abundant, but it has outbreak years where it can defoliate vast areas of the forest, which has significant effects on the forestry in this part of the world. So in 1990, for example, so 2.8 million hectares of forest was defoliated by this single species. And it basically speaks to the incredible power of species populations to grow. And this is where we start in ecology. So we start with trying to understand the growth of specific populations, single populations of a given species. And the fact is that sort of any population has this capacity to grow. So any population where the number of births going into the population exceeds the number of deaths coming out of it will grow. This is why, we got so concerned about COVID virus and its spread through populations, because as long as in the virus's case, it's infecting more people than a sort of either dying or becoming resistant to it, then that population will grow. And the power of that, as the gypsy moth demonstrates, is just incredibly scary. Samuel Butler realized that all progress is based on a universal innate desire on the part of every organism to live beyond its income. Every species wants to do this. But of course, most species don't grow exponentially like the gypsy moth. For most species, the death rate finally catches up with the birth rate, and the population growth levels out in this sort of characteristic S shape. So populations eventually stabilize. And of course, the reason that they do that is that other species come into play and stop the population from just completely going mad. So one way in which population growth is stopped is because resources run out. So armies march on their stomach. The footmen are a great example of this, because as their caterpillars feed on lichen, and as lichen have come back across the UK, as Clean Air Acts have allowed lichens to re-establish, so the footmen have come in. But eventually, all resources are finite. Eventually, food runs out, and that's particularly the case when you have other species, potentially competing for the same food. Classic example from the moth world is the winter moth and the green oak tortrix and their competition for oak trees. So in good years for these moths, they can completely strip oak trees of their leaves, and even in sort of normal years, they probably sort of take sort of 20% of the leaves off trees, and you can see the impacts of these species in the growth rings of trees. The competition is one way that population growth is stemmed, and another way is when the consumers become the consumed. Moths are a fantastic group for studying predation, because so many things are out to get them. And of course, as you'll know, sort of running a moth trap, some of those species are attracted to the trap as well. So this trap is based on the oak egger, one of the species I first caught down in Devon, because before I even caught one of those, I caught this species of parasitoid Enicospilus inflexus. And because I caught this species, which is a specialist on oak eggers, I knew that there must be oak eggers in the vicinity. And it was a couple of weeks after I first caught this that I caught my first oak egger. So it's one of those rare occasions where an ecologist makes a prediction, and that prediction turns out to be true. But there are loads and loads of predators that control moth populations. Parasitoids are a particularly fascinating group. Currently, I think there's around about 95,000 described species of parasitoid wasp, but it's estimated from studies of species, actually relatives of the eggers, that there's probably on average one specialist parasitoid wasp for each other insect on the planet. And there are also parasitoids of parasitoids. So there's probably, it's probably not unreasonable to say that half of all insects toids, but clearly not nearly half of all described insects are parasitoids. And of course, it's not just sort of insects that eat other insects. I'm sure that anyone that runs a moth trap will will know that the birds get used to where you're trapping, and many of the mornings, particularly in Devon, but also in London, I sort of spend my time trying to shoo away the birds that are trying to take the moths from under my nose. But moths are the basis of many food chains. They're an incredibly important group of organisms. You can do the calculations based on sort of nest provisioning rates to show that just for great and blue tits at the height of the breeding season in the UK, they're probably bringing in more than 2 billion caterpillars to their nests per day. They're sort of basically bringing in an insect every minute throughout the daylight hours. And that's just great and blue tits. Yeah, these are sort of some of the classic ways in which populations are kept in check, as Charles Darwin, of course, was only too aware. So births and deaths sort of are the fundamental the fundamental parameters of ecological systems, and sort of understanding sort of the interplay between those leads us to understand how populations grow or decline, why they don't grow out of control. What species do between birth and death actually then determines how they live their lives. So all organisms die, it comes to us all. But between birth and death, how organisms acquire resources and how they use those resources then gives rise to sort of fundamental differences in life histories. So it gives us differences between species like this codling moth up here, which in sort of the warmer parts of Europe can go through 6 generations a year, sort of go from egg to adult just in a few weeks, and cycle through many generations. And then you have species like the goat moth, this one, which I caught in Weir Quay in Devon, which can spend sort of 5 years as a larva in the heartwood of trees. And it's how species meet their deaths and the opportunities that gives them to grow and reproduce that then starts to sort of give us the different forms, the different structures we have in moths, and starts to sort of build up the diversity of species that we have in a moth trap. Of course, as I said, species don't live in isolation. Sort of competition and predation tells us that, but most studies of those processes focus on, just a couple or a few species, whereas in fact, species live together in communities. And trying to understand communities is one of the most difficult, I think, elements of understanding ecology. So, for much of the history of community ecology, we've sort of assumed that, species can live together if they have different roles, if they have different niches. You can sort of view it as like different jobs in the sort of ecological village. But that makes it very difficult to explain situations like, these 3 species here. When we have species like the uncertain here, the rustic, and sort of now as well with the spread of vines rustic, we have 3 species that live essentially very, very similar lives. They sort of feed on the same food plants. They're sort of flying at similar times of year. They have similar life histories. How is it that these 3 species that are essentially all doing the same thing can coexist? And what community ecologists are increasingly understanding and believing, I think, is that sort of much of community ecology is is a sort of first come, first served game of chance. The species that can live together in a community is defined as much by sort of what gets there and takes advantage of opportunities from a sort of a wider set of species that could potentially live together, but may or may not, depending on luck. So communities are less sort of orderly structured villages than just sort of random collections of species that happen to live together in certain areas at certain times, very much driven by the effects of chance and what's going on in the wider environment beyond the local community. What that then leads us on to is the realization that what goes on beyond a specific community is really important, and therefore that movement is really important. And obviously the apogee of movement is migration, but all species, essentially all individuals, rely on movement for a population to grow, for species to persist. Even sort of those archetypal sort of stationary things like trees, they have a life stage that is specifically geared to moving. They can't just grow where their parent is. They won't survive that way. So life isn't movement isn't a luxury. It's an essential. And I think one of the joys of being a moth trapper is migration. I mean, the silver Y is one of the classic species. Those, weighs about as much as a large raindrop, but it's an organism that can cruise at 40 to 50 kilometers an hour. It can cover more than 600 kilometers in a single night if it's got a following wind, and vast numbers will sort of migrate sort of up and down across the continent in any given year. And just the joy of trapping moths, and particularly at the site in Devon, is just the fact that you can get all these species coming up from Europe. So here's a little collection of the moths I caught last autumn down in Weir Quay. Just a fantastic selection of cool things, and not just in Devon as well. I mean, this is so a colleague and I run some traps at UCL East campus on the Olympic Park. So we put 3 traps out every Monday night on this bit of habitat. And last year we essentially caught nothing, except for the one night in summer when we caught a Dorset cream wave, which was the 8 record for Britain. It was just here basically, and you can see the environment. It's just insane that stuff will get there. But it's one of the absolute joys of being a mother. The fact that what goes on outside a community and movement really matters then leads you to have to think about what drives the diversity of the wider environment, and that then starts to lead you on to questions around speciation. So birth and death again, but now at the level of species rather than individuals, and how the interplay of birth and death and the factors that might drive that will then sort of determine the number of species that you have in the wider environment. Why we have 2,500 species of moth in the UK rather than 250 or 25,000. And obviously, those are the sort of fundamental processes that determine why, the sort of old world diversity of hawk moths looks like this. So the redder areas are the areas with more species. So we're up here. We have a few, but not many. But like 100 kilometers square in Southeast Asia can have 10 times as many species of hawk moth as we have ever recorded in the UK. And then you get situations like this. This is a moth sheet on Borneo, where this guy Dan Brown was doing this just last autumn. If only we had moth sheets like that in the UK. And then finally, you can't really talk about any sort of environmental questions these days without talking about change and how things are changing, and especially what humans are doing in the environment. So how we are sort of introducing new species to the environment, like the box tree moth, which I don't know if it's reached your traps yet in Devon, but it's a very common feature in London. Caught them on the first night. that I trapped there. And then obviously species like the stout dart here that you will no longer catch because it's in all likelihood extinct in the UK. And the reason for this is that, you know, humanity is essentially inveigling, or we're inveigling ourselves into all of these ecological processes. So we are now sort of a major cause of mortality, where it literally our impacts are changing the evolution of species, we're changing life histories, they're changing distributions. We are changing everything about the natural world. And just a shout out to my host and great work sort of studying the declines of species. It's sad to see, but yeah, we all know that moths are on the decline and have been for decades. And then just finally, sort of finishing up by trying to make the point that we are a species like all the rest. So, you know, we are born, we die. What we do with the resources that we acquire between our births and deaths sort of drives our life histories. But we're equally dependent on the natural world as any other species. And so what we are doing to it is an existential threat to ourselves. But nevertheless, as is illustrated by this Acer sober, relatively recently described micromoth species, it's, you know, there's so much out there to learn about and to find out about moths. A never-ending source of fascination. And so hopefully what the aim of the book really is to show that, you know, when we pay attention to these tiny animals, these moths, it basically tells us a larger truth about the world. And the point being that the contents of this one small box, a moth trap, depend on the workings of all of nature. So thank you very much for your attention. All I will finish up by saying is that if you don't yet have a copy of the Jewel Box, I'm sure you all do, but the paperback is out in June. So you could always wait for that. But thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you tonight.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tim. Really enlightening. And yes, for those who haven't got the book yet or haven't read the book yet, there's obviously a lot more detail on each of those themes that you've touched on tonight. We probably have time for some questions if anyone wants to take themselves off mute or wave at me or put their hand up or something like that. Be very happy. Yeah, Phil, take yourself off mute if you can.
Right, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good stuff. That was really good, fascinating stuff, and some lovely statistics at the beginning. Can you say something about eukaryotes and prokaryotes, which I think my total knowledge is only single-celled creatures?
Well, so there are single-celled eukaryotes. So things like amoeba and you know, paramecium, those things that you know, we poked at on petri dishes as school kids, they're eukaryotes. It's basically about the nucleus. So a eukaryote has the chromosomes are contained within a nucleus in the cell, and in a prokaryote they're not. They sort of float free. So that's the technical the technical definition. So most, you know, bacteria are the sort of archetypal prokaryotes, and it's probably the case that eukaryotes developed by as a mutualism between prokaryotic cells. So that essentially, like things like our mitochondria and chloroplasts were probably originally sort of free living organisms that have been subsumed into other cells. But it's technically all down to the nucleus, and I think if my Latin was better, I could tell you exactly what you and prokaryote mean.
Don't worry. That's great. Thank you.
Great. No, it's a good question, Phil, because yeah, I was rummaging back in my my O-level biology to try and pluck that one out as well. Are there any other questions for Tim?
I will say, while people are thinking that, if anyone does have a copy of the book and would like it signed, or I have a set of book plates that I can sign and send people. So if you drop me an email, very happily do that for people.
That's very kind. I can't see everyone at once, so if you do have a question, then feel free to just unmute yourself and shout it out. But, so I was going to ask Tim whether, I mean, do you think moths is there some special quality about moths that makes them particularly good at explaining all of this, or is it just that they're really cool and you spend a lot of time staring into the contents of your moth trap, early in the morning or late at night, and pondering these the greater mysteries of biology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of both, really. I mean, obviously, I think they're incredibly cool organisms, but I think a lot of other people do as well. I mean, I was inspired to, write about ecology based on moths, but it wasn't really until I started to do that process that I realized, just how many sort of foundational studies there are that that are based on moths, and just the extensive literature on them. I mean, I could have written the whole book about the gypsy moth in the United States. I mean, the literature is immense, and really detailed studies on predation and population regulation in the species. But there's many fundamental studies, and even in term, even up to diversification, because almost all diversification studies focus on birds and mammals, because you have to know all the species, and you have to know where they are to be able to really understand the drivers of overall diversification and species richness. So we know that for birds, we know it pretty well for mammals, but for almost no other groups do we know that, except hawk moths, which of course are essentially honorary megafauna. So we can explore some of the drivers of hawk moth diversity. It's only a small part of overall moth diversity, but there isn't a question in ecology, I think, that people haven't looked at moths to try and explain.
Excellent. No, there's loads of stuff out there, and there's loads of stuff that I've never encountered in my in my professional life in moths and butterflies, that just, like you say, vast literatures around pest control and moths, which if you're a conservation biologist like me, then you just don't really ever encounter that, although I'm sure there are some amazing nuggets of information.
Well, yeah, I mean, looking at migrants, you sort of Google diamondback moth, and the literature on those is just enormous, because they're a major pest species. I mean, I think it's potentially the least interesting element of of them, but so much out there.
Yeah, right. Janet, yes.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I was absolutely fascinated with this idea about communities of moths. I've never even thought about that, with the uncertain and the rustic and the vines rustic you're talking about. What about the sort of ones that predate on them? Do you sort of get a whole different set of those, or do they all does it tend to be one predator that would associate with all those different types of species?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting, because when we think about communities, we tend to just think about like that specific group of species, because you're starting to think of the trophic levels above and below. It becomes incredibly complicated. But I mean, I think that probably the same is true. So because there's a lot of specialist predators, their presence is going to be driven to a large extent by the species that are there to consume, in the same way that the presence of moths is determined to a fair degree by the host plant. But equally, as I'm sure I mean, there's lots of areas where you have the host plant and you don't have the moths, and it's kind of not obvious why that is. But then the generalist predators will they will be driven largely by the sort of the diversity and the availability. So those community effects, I think, do propagate up and down the food chain. But it's hard enough to think about it even in the context of one trophic level without, yeah, all the
Yeah,
trophic levels on
getting
top
too
of that.
complicated. Yeah.
Then you get into food webs, and I mean, yeah, in my view as an ecologist, you don't want to get into food webs. It's just it's just a nightmare.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Right, so I'm not seeing any other questions, not seeing anyone else unmute themselves. So so thanks very much, Tim, for that. That was really interesting, and yeah, it's a really cool. You know, we all love moths, so thanks to you and your book, we can all learn more about general science, general biology. By sort of expanding and extrapolating from these wonderful moth examples. So
Thanks. Yeah, I think in the acknowledgements I say that, you know, the moth bits will disappoint the moth people and the ecology bits will disappoint the ecologists. But if the moth people like the ecology and the ecologists like the moth bits, then I'll probably be okay.
Yeah, that's great. Very good. Great. So we're kind of on time now, which is good. So we'll move on to our second speaker of the evening, Rebecca Levey. So sorry you've not had a chance to test things in advance, Rebecca. My system was telling me that you weren't here, steadfastly telling me that you weren't here. So Tim and I were busy chatting away and testing things and saying, oh, I wonder where Rebecca is. And then you were probably there all along. So sorry about that. But,
well, people will just have to deal with the testing now if it has to be tested.
Indeed. We'll prepare for technical catastrophe. But I've made you a co-host, so you should be able to share. Yeah, that's looking good.
Yep. Cool.
Great. While you're just switching that to screen to like show mode. So yeah, the reason why I've asked Rebecca to be our other guest speaker of the evening is that she's had the rather wonderful job over the last few years of working on a project, butterfly conservation project called Kent's Magnificent Moths, and come back to where it was before. And shortly, we'll be able to enjoy some of these wonderful moths, these very rare moth species that Rebecca has been working on. How are you doing there? Are you on mute at the minute? That's good.
Okay.
Okay, great.
I just crashed about 5 times in a row. Apart from that.
Well, welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Well, so thank you for that introduction, Richard. This is the Kent's Magnificent Moths project, and it is a 3-year project being funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and being led on by Butterfly Conservation. And it started in April 2021, so we're nearly at our end now. We're 2 years and 11 months in. But this is the largest conservation project Butterfly Conservation has done that focuses on a particular region with its rare moth species. And we've been coordinating management and increased awareness for these 8 priority moth species to increase the amount of habitat available for them to spread within their landscapes, as well as raising awareness within their local communities of just how special it is to be supporting some of these species on our doorstep. So going back to the beginning of why we're looking at the magnificent moths of Kent and not Devon, it goes back to a map, this map. So as targeted conservation work needs dedicated people in an area to deliver it, with the advice to landowners and training to volunteers in surveying, it was decided we would pick one region of the UK to focus all the moth attention on for the 3-year project. So this map of where all the biodiversity action plan species are was created. And you can see there are quite a few hotspots in the south, but what set the Kent species apart is many of them couldn't be found in any other part of the UK. They were Kent endemics, if you will. And the south of England generally is the northern climactic limit for many of those species that spread here from Europe and set up their breeding populations. But with Kent being the closest mainland point to the continent and also containing a wide range of varied habitats, many species that have been in decline across the former ranges as habitat had been lost have managed to retain a foothold in Kent. So the Kent's magnificent moths were born. And speaking of when the project was being developed, way back now in 2019, before we knew what was about to happen to us, 4 of our project's 8 priority moth species were considered Kent endemics, ones that could only be found in Kent. But as soon as the project started, exciting new population discoveries in Sussex of these top 2 moths, the bright wave and the Sussex emerald, mean that only the bottom 2 of the 8 are now exclusive to Kent, which is good for them. And it means I could give some talks to Sussex Moth Group and get them involved as well. So these are the Kent exclusive now. Kent Moth Group is still happy to have those ones. But when the project began, these were each only found on a handful of sites within Kent. They're both granted legal protection from disturbance, meaning it's actually illegal to catch and handle them without a specific protected species licence from Natural England. So some people had been looking for them, others hadn't. Sometimes if someone found one, they would go, am I allowed to tell anyone I found it because it's illegal for me to look at it? So a part of the battle at the beginning is just telling people it's okay to look for them and we want people to find out where they are. So starting with the Sussex emerald and the bright wave, when we started, these were considered coastal species requiring coastal habitats, which was vegetated shingle for the Sussex emerald and coastal sandy grasslands with not much vegetation for the bright wave. And both of these moths needed their caterpillar food plants to be found alongside a very warm microclimate because of their caterpillars. So those sit on low-growing wildflower leaves over the winter, and they wouldn't survive on sites that get inundated and get flooded. So that had been restricting them, as well as their need for a specific type of food plant. But moths can't always read the books we write saying where they're meant to live. And in 2023, this lovely meadow area was being surveyed for small blue butterflies. And we discovered that Sussex emerald and bright wave were both here as well, in much greater numbers than their traditional coastal sites and well away from where the books said they were meant to be, but still in Kent. Their food plants are abundant here. These areas in only 2010 were still completely arable. They're part of Natural England funded farm regeneration and restoration projects that work at a landscape scale and work with neighbouring farms and get them to also a similar kind of seed mixture and link up their networks. So there's a network of wildflower margins in between farm fields, all alongside a busy dual carriageway, and nice 13-year-old meadows. And the moths appear to be thriving here, so they no longer need to be by the coast. And this is a graph of just the bright wave abundance in Kent over the past few years, and you can see this one population discovery inland has significantly changed, where we're going to focus our efforts for the bright wave moth. This spring, our volunteers will be back surveying this new landscape further for the caterpillars to see if the requirements of the caterpillars are different in this landscape. And once we know their requirements, there's potential for farmers to massively improve the fortunes of these species as more arable land in the landscape continues to be linked up and more meadows like this are created. So starting with a nice positive story. And going on to another positive story is the fiery clearwing. Some of you may be more familiar with clearwings since the more widespread availability and use of pheromone lures for different species. You can see them popping up in your garden now. But this particular clearwing is not a species that commonly frequents gardens. The fiery clearwing, named for its orangey red scales on its wings. And the food plant is not rare. It's curled dock. That's in a lot of places. But again, it needs a very warm, free draining microclimate because, like many other clearwings, you don't typically see the caterpillar. They will be inside a stem or a root of a plant. And this one is almost exclusively the root. So over the winter, again, they can't be dealing with any areas that are flooded. They're going to be feeding on the root over the winter. So it's their microhabitat requirements that have made them rare in the UK so far. And because fiery clearwing is a legally protected species, we don't particularly recommend waving around particular pheromone laws, trying to disturb them. But there is an easy way, and that's looking for their eggs. And the eggs aren't quite as colourful and easy to spot as these ones. A fiery clearing survey just involves going on a coastal walk and then telling whoever you're with to stop every time you see a cold dock plant whilst you check the stem for these, the shiny black eggs freshly laid by a fiery clearing moth. I tell people they look a bit like black Tic Tacs. If you look up information about this species' habitat preferences in a book, it'll say every fiery clearing breeding site is like this beach, a free draining substrate, plenty of cold dock plants, growing in the areas that the waves will never reach to wash them away. In recent winters, though, storms have washed away increasingly more of these coastal sites, and the number of plants and eggs found on them has been declining. So we were quite worried about the fiery clearwing when the project started. But an adult fiery clearwing was spotted in 2020 by someone on a walk on a site 2 kilometres inland from one of their traditional breeding sites. It didn't have the traditional microclimate or a free draining soil, so I can't say I was expecting much when we came here, hoping that fiery clearings had been forced inland and had found that they were a bit less picky about their breeding habitat requirements. And after tripping over a breeding pair of fiery clearing moths in that very same arable field edge during my first survey of this completely unsuitable site, according to all the field guides, it was pretty compelling evidence that they were breeding here, and a further check of the surrounding dock plants found hundreds of their shiny black eggs too. And if you want to tell a female from a male, they do have a different number of white bands on their abdomen, but the easiest way is males have got a nice grey fuzz around their thorax, lots of hair, and females have shaved, they're nice and smooth. So that's the way to tell them apart. So the female's on the left, and you very rarely see a female because if someone's used a pheromone, it only works on a male. So seeing a female is very nice. And before the project started, there were 13 fiery clearing populations we knew about that were coastal, and almost all of those were declining. And after hosting egg identification training days for 35 new volunteers and asking them to keep a lookout in the surrounding areas while they were on walks inland, a total of 24 new breeding locations were found. 2 formerly known populations were rediscovered. Fiery clearings are still restricted to Kent for now, but if their rate of spread inland continues, I don't think it will be long before they realise curled dock is a common plant and they increase their distribution further and start crossing county borders. But for the moment, it retains its legal protection and monitoring is continuing, as 3 of the new sites are already threatened by development proposals and many more sites that they've colonised could be classed as brownfield areas which have potential to be affected by developments in the future. Moving on to a micromoth. The white-spotted sable is the micromoth of the project. It's a woodland species that benefits from encouraging more traditional woodland management practices and increasing the abundance of their food plants in different ways is what we've been doing, as well as monitoring them for signs of their caterpillars. Up close, it's completely unmistakable, jet black with white polka dots and orange hair tufts. Our knowledge of where they are in Kent is quite limited though, only being recorded from an average of 1 or 2 sites a year. And the clue for why this is, well, it's in the name micromoth. It's about the size of your fingernail. It only flies in sunshine and it has a tendency to spiral down into ground vegetation, never to be seen again when it's disturbed, which is not ideal when we need photos to back up records if it's from any site other than a known site. And as well as getting more people out and about looking for this micromoth, we were planting its caterpillar food plant called goldenrod, not big bushy Canadian goldenrod, but the smaller native woodland wildflower that is more easily noticed when it's in flower in late summer and early autumn. And goldenrod is a caterpillar food plant for over 40 of the UK's moth species, with many exclusively feeding on it, including the white-spotted sable, but also the less colourful species, like the goldenrod pug, Coleophora ramosella, the starwort, Eucosma aspidiscana, Coleophora verduriae, something along those lines, and the scarce goldenrod plume. And there's a reason why most woodland ground flora chooses to flower in the spring, to receive more sunlight before the leaves are on all the trees. And goldenrod is in decline as woodlands are becoming too dark for them to flower in the late summer and autumn, with the decline of traditional management techniques of woodlands like coppicing of glades on rotation, linked by wide open rides, which will benefit all the invertebrates who depend upon sunny woodland areas for their food plants to survive. So we've been mapping out different woodlands, seeing how dense the goldenrod is, and then adding extra goldenrod in areas that need it to help connect up junctions, and so that the moths that are very thinly spread out along this big woodland area join up and find each other in areas with dense goldenrod. And last August, we successfully found a new area for this species in a Forestry England managed woodland, which has been receiving coppicing management to benefit heath fritillary butterflies, which has also allowed the population of goldenrod to naturally spread without any need for planting. And there have been occasional adult sightings here, but lots of people have visited this area during the moth's flight period for heath fritillaries without seeing adult moths. So they weren't convinced it was breeding here despite the abundance of the food plant. And previous studies have found the moth doesn't have a great dispersal distance, with individuals in mark release recapture studies never knowing to move from one glade to another. But the population was actually confirmed here not by finding the distinctive adults, but by finding small green caterpillars. that feed on the leaves, creating little window hole feeding signs, allowing them to be found by turning over the leaves and proving that the moth is breeding at sites where adults haven't even been seen. So despite the moth's distinctive appearance, and it is very pretty, we learnt that searching for adults may not actually be the best survey method at sites that have very low densities. And obviously the public are more likely to engage with the adult moth rather than the caterpillar. So through art workshops, with a mental wellbeing charity, outdoor school engagement sessions of the game Find the Moth in the Woods, and a big moth night event when woodland was the theme back in 2022, people in the community learnt more about this species, and native goldenrod has been an addition to many a garden in the area after community allotment groups organise seeding events to connect up the garden habitats that border the woodlands. Another very distinctive looking moth that we've had success finding on new sites is the black-veined moth. Now, these moths are only found along one valley of chalk grassland in rural Kent. We believe the UK individuals might be part of their own subspecies with more particular requirements than their European relatives, which are not as rare or as fussy. And although they're mostly active at dusk when adults will patrol around the habitat, the males particularly, it's easiest to count the total number of moths in a field by day, as they tend to flutter up and resettle when we walk through their habitat. And this species requires a habitat mosaic with both short grassland areas that contain the wildflowers, which is actually what their caterpillars feed on, but also these long, dense tussocks of coarser grasses, which is what they lay their eggs in, and it's where the caterpillars will shelter over the winter months. And this is the valley and the publicly accessible sites where you could go visit a black-veined moth if you wanted to are pointed out at the top and the bottom. And through our management advice to Natural England's farm advisors in the landscape, we've been connecting up this valley. And these different areas are now exchanging individuals, building up meta-populations in the area rather than isolated fields. And 2023 was their best year on record, with an increase from 10 meta-populations up to 12, made up of 35 different fields. But some of our volunteer surveys now start a whole 2 months before the moths fly. This photo is from a not too chilly April survey day, when sweep nets were deployed to confirm these moths are actually breeding in new sites that don't yet look suitable for them because they don't have dense, coarse grass tussocks yet. But we did find double figures of caterpillars here, meaning they are less fussy with their larval habitat requirements than they used to be. Reasons for this, potentially because their population size has been growing. It's leading to some individuals being pushed into what was considered suboptimal habitat, and they're finding that they can in fact successfully breed there, and then the next generation breeds there, and then they spread a bit more. But there's probably also a climactic link, allowing this spread whereby winters aren't as frosty as they used to be, and the caterpillars can survive those warmer winters without needing quite so much grass as shelter. But whatever the reason, the black-veined moth is doing a lot better within its landscape, and we're hopeful it might be able to spread out of its valley and into another one. This has also led to great engagement opportunities, including sunny survey walks, school projects, moth biscuits, helping out the cattle by removing some scrub from wildflower areas with these tree popper tools. These are the giant yellow levers in the photos, which allow the removal of young saplings before they take hold and reduce the amount of light on the chalk grassland that allows the wildflowers the moths need to grow. Similar work is also happening for another chalk grassland moth called the straw bell. But that moth, unfortunately, has been doing less well. The straw bell is in decline, with only 9 breeding sites left in the UK. And this is the only moth out of our 8 that we haven't found a new population for during our 3 years of the project. So it still needs more work. So chalk grassland is a rare enough habitat in itself, but what makes the straw bell even more specific is their dependence on both the similar winter cattle grazing regime the black-fay moth likes, but also their requirement to be only on the south of the hillside. And that's going to be a temperature thing. So potentially as the climate warms, maybe they might decide they're okay with a west-facing hillside. But at the moment, it's still just the south. And these hills are close enough to each other that they can exchange individuals, and the straw bell populations are linked to a larger metapopulation across the landscape. And the south-facing slopes are just that little bit warmer in the spring, and it's only there that they're found breeding. This area in the foreground hasn't had any management for a number of years though, and unfortunately the straw bells haven't been seen here for quite a few years. But given how close the existing straw bell hills are, we think a recolonisation could be swift. And there's the little straw bell moth. That's a male. He has lovely feathered antennae. So we have deployed a lot of winter work into this hillside on the right to get it back into condition for the straw bell, and that will help link up Folkestone to Dover and connect the populations that are there. And it was a mammoth undertaking to reclaim the steep chalk grassland slope from the scrub that had moved in, but there's now access from the bottom, large areas of scrub removed that will combined allow the reinstation of cattle grazing, and together with some continued volunteer management, the straw bell's next hillside home will be monitored in the hope that they're able to spread along here in the coming years. But for some of our moths, creating new habitat is less of a digger job and more of a garden centre community group job. And that is the case for the marshmallow moth, where we have hundreds and hundreds of caterpillar food plants, including the delicate pink flowers of these marshmallow plants for this species, the marshmallow moth, which, as its name suggests, it is completely dependent on a marshmallow plant. But to support a population of this moth, you don't just need one marshmallow plant. You need about 500 flowering spikes as a minimum to get a sustainable population of this moth that will continue in the long term. So unfortunately, most people's gardens don't have the space for 500 marshmallow plants, but people can still help us out by growing marshmallow seeds on into small plants, coming along to planting days and adding their own pot-grown plants onto farmland. And some of these sites are already taking really well. This has been by far the most popular moth that people wanted to help create habitat for, with hundreds of people helping to grow their light pink flowers and plant them out in clumps around ponds and ditches in the Romney Marsh area near Dungeness. And it'll take several years before a plant's root is big enough for the moth caterpillar to be able to feed on it without killing off the plant. But within a few years, they should be able to spread and colonize these new areas in the landscape. And they have a similar life cycle to our next species, which is the Fisher's estuary moth. But this species is quite late in the year. It waits until mid-September to emerge. So this rounds out our moth year. And this moth looks quite similar to a frosted orange, if that's a species you're more familiar with, but it's at least a third bigger These are noticeably large, chunky moths, which makes them easy to pick out on surveys. And as you can see from the row of beach huts behind the sea of hogs fennel plants here, at their main site, this borders a very populated seaside area in Kent with a high footfall. So our work started with engaging the locals about the importance of not trampling through the middle of the site to protect the moth's habitat, and ensuring the local park run group were keeping to the main paths instead of running through the plants as a shortcut. Before the moth's flight period, a local litter picking group join us in the summer to find these caterpillar frass piles. We call them white poo volcanoes to get the children slightly more interested in looking for them. And they're running all over the place going, I found some caterpillar poo. But we also set up an annual Meet the Moth Torchlight survey evening for this moth, which is continuing beyond the project, led by our species champion. And these evenings have proved very popular, with locals being joined by London mothers who would get the train down specially to see this moth, and then go back by about 10 p.m. So it is possible in an evening. And similarly to the marshmallow moth, the easiest way to connect and expand the habitat in the landscape for this moth is to plant more of their food plants, and that is hog's fennel. Not as common and easy to spread as standard fennel is. So we would trim areas and plant the plants so they had a chance to establish before the dense grasses grew back in. And again, it'll take several years before these young plants have big enough roots to support a fish's estuarine caterpillar feeding on them. So monitoring will be continued by the site volunteers in the future to monitor how long it takes for a moth to colonize an area of new habitat. And that's all the rare moths, just a few of them. But away from specific rare moths, we've also been just chatting to people generally about moths, getting beginners involved, developing beginner moth resources, including an ID presentation. And that broke down how to identify macro moth to family groups and making opening up a moth trap a little bit less daunting for complete beginners. And we're hoping to make that resource available online to broaden its reach beyond Kent as well. So at the end of our legacy, a grand total of 343 moth events were held over the project's 3 years, and the legacy of which is one that we hope will be continued by all the people who came to learn about moths, not always just the rare ones. And moth mornings have been set up in new parts of Kent that they weren't happening in before, so that more people than before can continue to monitor how the moths are doing as more habitat is created with them in mind. And our events are continuing with a talk series we have planned and made free for everyone to attend, even if you're from outside of Kent. With a focus on sharing the top features to tell your tricky garden moth species apart. So if you need a refresher on how to tell a Langmaid's yellow underwing from a lesser broad-bordered yellow underwing, just search the internet for moth identification tips with Phil Sterling and sign up on Eventbrite for a free space. Sessions 1 and 2 have already happened. But session 1's already on Butterfly Conservation's YouTube page, and session 2 will be following once I have edited it. So they're in the pipeline. And that's the end. I'll leave you with a lovely display board from Hornbeam Primary School. If you can figure out which moths those are meant to be, then I think some of them are recognisable for a primary school attempt. Yeah. Anyway.
Great. Thanks very much, Rebecca. Yeah, I like the blue one with the green stripes. I'm not sure what that is.
I don't know what that one
Pretty
is.
cool. That's excellent. It's such a great project, so inspiring, and although obviously there are some species that are still kind of hanging on. Obviously, there's a lot of really good news in there as well. So, excuse me. Some clapping going on, which is always good. So again, I invite anyone who's got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and just shout out. And while we wait for that, oh, there's Barry. I think, have you unmuted, Barry?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I just wondered. I mean, Brightwave occasionally turns up in Devon. I mean, I think there's probably 3 records. I mean, these are clearly immigrants from the continent. Do you think there's any chance they could establish themselves here?
I think so. There's been quite a few different counties now that are getting a few increased number of records, more records than you would maybe expect for just migrants. So there is a proper breeding population in Sussex now. They've found that, and that is too far away from Kent for it to have colonized from the Kent. So it must have been colonized by migrants and then decided, oh, I quite like the habitat here. I think I'll stay. So definitely a possibility.
Thank you.
It's possible, I guess, that, I mean, depending on how long the Kent populations have been isolated from their continental brothers and sisters, they might have become relatively specialized, like has happened with the swallowtail butterfly, for example, in Britain. And that immigrant, as you say, as you're suggesting just then, Rebecca, that immigrant ones coming over might have, you know, slightly less specific habitat or microclimate requirements, might aid their colonization, maybe.
Yeah, well, the Kent population seems to be becoming less specialized as it moves inland. So maybe topped up by some migrants, but they seem to be just, it was a few drought years meant that their coastal grassland areas, a lot of their wildflowers died off, and they may have just been forced to move inland to try and find suitable breeding habitat. And once they did, they thought, oh, there's loads of it here. Yeah. We'll just spread, and that's what they've done. But we're only 1 year into this new inland area, so lots more study to be done there to figure out what their new requirements are. It's definitely hopeful.
Very good. Great. Anyone else? Yes, Tim. Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really fascinating. The fiery clearwing, are people surveying for that beyond Kent? Because it strikes me it's only a short hop across, you know, like the Thames estuary to Suffolk, into Essex and then up to Suffolk.
It's on my to-do list to go over to Essex and have a look, because it's not very far now, and I don't think anyone's looking for fiery clearwing eggs in Essex currently. And which pheromone laws can work for fiery clearing, there's no specific one, but that isn't publicized anywhere, and I don't think people are trying it. So I'm sure if someone had found it in Essex already, they'd have said something on X. So I'm assuming no one's looked yet, but it's definitely within the realms of possibility. It's something that will probably be at somewhere like Swanscombe Marshes if someone had a look for it there. That's not that far from London. Yeah.
And sorry, and are the eggs like visible at the same time as the adults are on the wing?
Yes. So I tend to start looking second half of June for eggs, and then eggs are still on the stem first week of August. So the eggs are there for a whole month, whereas your lifespan of an adult is probably only a few days, which is why it's a lot easier to find their eggs. But obviously the adult's quite nice as well. So if you go to suitable habitat in second half of June, first half of July, that's when you've got the best chance of finding eggs and adults on the same site without even using a pheromone lure. You just look down, find some eggs on a curled duck plant, and there's normally a fiery clearing not that far away on some of these sites now.
I take a field course to Blakeney Point every year, and there's a patch of curled dock that looks just like, you know, the habitat shot you showed from Kent, and I mean, and that's a long way north, obviously, but certainly next time I'm there in summer, I'll have a look for them, because
It's worth a look.
Yeah, you never know.
It's great, thank you. I was wondering, Rebecca, I mean, I know obviously the project's kind of coming to an end imminently, but given that a fair few of these very rare species are now a lot less rare in Kent and indeed beyond, partly as a result of their own efforts and partly as a result of the project's efforts, is there a kind of another cohort of kind of moths now which are Kent's rarest and most threatened moths? You know, should there be a Kent's Magnificent Moths 2 at some point that you know, obviously as these species kind of, many of them have kind of gone up, are less threatened, they might have overtaken other species that are more precarious.
Yes, I think you'd be mostly delving into micro moths if you were looking for species that were Kent specific and rarer than these ones. If anyone wants to Google Hypercalia citrinalis, that's a very nice micro moth that's in Kent, and that is definitely on our next list. Not an official Kent Magnificent Moths Project 2, because it's quite hard to get funding for moths generally. You may only need one butterfly species to get your project funded in some places, but we needed 8 moths. So different rules apply, and different rules will probably apply again if we tried to convince someone to fund a project for 8 micro moths rather than macro moths. So at the moment, they're very small and most of them are brown, but they are on the next priority list, the species that are still completely confined to Kent, but less likely to be made into posters at the moment. I'm going to say that.
Apart from citrinalis, as you say, which is cover star of the new version of the Micromoth Field Guide. It's a stunner. Great, right. I'm not seeing any other questions from anyone, so I think we will wrap up. And I'm sure you'll all join me. Thanks very much for all coming along. It's great that we've been able to record the meeting as well, so I'm sure there'll be lots of other people will watch the recording once we've put that onto YouTube and publicized it through our newsletters and things. So I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking our 2 guest speakers, Tim and Rebecca, very much for fascinating insight into the world of moths slightly beyond Devon. It's been really, really good evening. So thanks very much. Great. I'm going to stop the recording.